Now it's recording.
Hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Storytime with Nonie. I'm Nonie, and this is Finnegan. And we're going to be telling you a very special story that has lots of chapters in it. It's called Hind's Feet on High Places. A hind is actually another name for a deer. But before we get into the story, I would like you to meet my mother, Grandma Rhoda. She's here. She's helping us video this story time with Nonie. So come on over here, Mother. I want the boys and girls to meet you. This is Grandma Rhoda.
Hi, boys and girls.
And I just want you to know this is a very special thing because my mother is the one who taught me how to tell stories and the importance of knowing Jesus and loving Jesus and of loving the Word of God. And so she's going to be helping us today. Even if you can't see her, she's behind the camera. Thank you. Thank you, Mother. All right. So, boys and girls, this story is not a true story, but it is a story that is called an allegory because it's not about real people, but it's about people who can teach us a lesson. There's lessons in this story that we can learn. So I'm going to tell you about a little girl by the name of Much Afraid. You see, we don't really know anybody whose name is Much Afraid. At least I don't. Do you? Have you ever met anybody named Much Afraid? I doubt it. But I'll bet that you know people who are much afraid. You might even be one of those people who are much afraid. I used to be much afraid. I was afraid of everything. I was afraid of the dark. I was afraid to talk to people. Oh, lots of things. Afraid of bugs. Whatever it was. And anyhow, Jesus helped me to overcome that. But our little girl named Much Afraid in the story, she works for the chief shepherd. Now, if Much Afraid represents us, who do you think that the chief shepherd might represent? Do you know that the Bible talks about Jesus being our shepherd? So that's right. In the story, when we talk about the shepherd, we're really talking about Jesus. Well, Much Afraid loved Jesus, and she worked for him, and every single morning she would get up and she would get dressed and run out to the pasture where Jesus would be, or the shepherd would be taking care of the sheep. And she would meet with him out there, and he would talk to her and give her the directions for the day and tell her what he wanted her to do. And then she would go back to her village and do exactly what the shepherd had told her to do. Now, Much Afraid lived in a big valley called the Valley of Humiliation. Do you know what humiliation is? That's like when you just feel so ashamed all the time, like there's nothing that you can do right. That was the name of the valley she lived in. And the name of her village, where all her neighbors' houses and where her little house was, that was called the village of Much Trembling. So, do you know, when do you tremble? It's usually when you're afraid, huh? Like, can you do that? Kind of scared. Tremble, tremble. That was the name of the village that Much Afraid lived in. Well, she had a lot of neighbors in this village who also worked for the shepherd. And she admired them very, very much because you know what? These people had made a journey to the high places, great big high mountains, and when they came back, they weren't afraid anymore. Much Afraid just could not imagine how it would feel not to be afraid. She was so afraid, and she didn't want to be afraid. The shepherd wasn't afraid. She wanted to be just like the shepherd. Well, She thought it was impossible for her to ever be able to get to the high places because she had some problems. You see, Much Afraid didn't have a mom or a dad. Much Afraid grew up in the house of her aunt, who was named Dismal Forebodings. Here's her aunt. Dismal Forebodings is kind of like when you are always afraid that something bad is going to happen. So, like my mother taught me many good things in life, her aunt did not teach her anything but how to be afraid. So you can understand why Much Afraid was so afraid. And she lived with her cousins, Gloomy, who's always sad, always seeing the bad side of things, and her cousin Spiteful, who was always just kind of angry. And then there was her cousin, Craven Fear. Craven means always, really, so afraid, terrified. And he was a big bully who always did these mean things to Much Afraid. So, that was the home that Much Afraid grew up in. She had only learned how to be afraid of everything. And even though she worked for the shepherd, she still had this horrible fear. And along with all the good people who lived in the village of Much Trembling, as you saw over here, there were some people who did not work for the shepherd. You can see how this village wasn't always a nice place because there were a lot of fearing relatives who lived there that made this village what it was, Much Trembling. And so, Much Afraid, in wanting to go to the high places, was afraid she would never be able to make it because of her fear, but she had some other problems too. Much Afraid had very crippled feet. Oftentimes when she would be working, doing the shepherd's work, she would fall down because her feet just didn't do what they were supposed to do like other people's feet did. And she had a very crooked mouth, and she couldn't always speak the way she wanted to speak. So one day, Much Afraid, in her little cottage, in her darling, peaceful little white cottage, heard a knock at the door. She went to the door, and she opened the door, and there were her fearing relatives. You know what? She should not have let them in the house. But because she got so afraid at just the sight of them, she let them into their house. In fact, they kind of pushed their way in, and she let them in. And they came right on in there, and they said, "Much Afraid, we've got news for you. You are going to marry your cousin, Craven Fear." Much Afraid was so frightened and so upset. She didn't know what to think. And then she just kind of crouched down and in the corner, and she was like, "I can't marry Craven Fear. I just can't. I won't marry Craven Fear." And they kept saying, "You will marry Craven Fear. You have no choice in this matter." Well, finally, her fearing relatives left. It was almost evening, and poor little Much Afraid hardly wasn't able to think straight. She was so upset. And all of a sudden she remembered that the shepherd would also come every evening to hear how the day had gone. So Much Afraid hurried out her door and ran to the pasture where the shepherd was. And there he was, and she began to tell him everything that had happened that day. How her fearing relatives had come and wanted her to marry her cousin Craven Fear. Well, the shepherd first of all said, "Oh, Much Afraid, you shouldn't have let them in because they hate me. They're my enemies. And I know that they don't want you to be in my service. I know they want you to quit your job working for me. But Much Afraid, if you will trust me, we will overcome this together. I have big plans for you, Much Afraid, and the fearing relatives are trying to keep you from following my plans for you. Much Afraid said, I know I shouldn't have let them in. I just couldn't think straight. And she just all of a sudden looked up and saw the high places. She saw the mountains that were off in the distance. And she said, oh, I wish that I could go to the high places, to the kingdom of love, so that I wouldn't ever have to be afraid again. And the shepherd was like, oh, Much Afraid, you don't know how long I've waited to hear those words from you, because I want you to come to the high places. She said, you do? You want me to go to the high places? How is that possible? I think that's impossible, because look at me. I have crippled feet and I have a crooked mouth, and there's no way I could ever make it up there. And besides that, there's my fearing relatives, and they would never let me go on a journey to the high places. And the shepherd said, well, Much Afraid, it is very true that in order to get to the high places, it's a very hard journey. And you would have to have feet like a hind, feet like a deer, where you could go jumping and leaping. I have feet just like that myself. But you see, Much Afraid, it is possible, because even though your feet are crooked now, as you begin on your journey, I will change your feet to become hind's feet like mine. And your mouth will all be healed one of these days if you start on this journey, because there won't be anything crippled or crooked in the kingdom of love. And as for your fearing relatives, I'll protect you from them. But you're going to have to decide that you're ready and willing to go on this journey. And Much Afraid was like, oh, yes, I can't wait. When can we start? And the shepherd said, well, Much Afraid, I will give you 2 helpers to help you on your journey. Oh, that's fantastic. Yes, I'm going to need helpers. Because he says, you see, I will help you to the foot of the mountains, but then you won't always see me after that. But when you call out to me, I will be right there with you. Whenever you call me, I'll come. I'll be there immediately. And she was getting so excited. And then he said, there's one more thing, Much Afraid. There is no fear in the kingdom of love. And so I want to give you a new name. Are you willing to let me take your name of Much Afraid and replace it with a new name that will describe who you will be in the kingdom of love? And she said, a new name? Yes, I don't want to be Much Afraid anymore. And so the shepherd said, all right then, Much Afraid, I am going to plant the seed of love in your heart. And she felt something. And then he said, when it is time, when you get to the kingdom of love, that seed is going to bloom within you, and that's when you will be given your new name. And so, boys and girls, that's where our story is going to end. Much Afraid went back to her cottage to wait for the shepherd to call her so that she would know it was time to begin her journey. So I'll see you next time on Storytime with Nonie, where we learn more about Much Afraid's journey to the high places. Bye-bye.